So, hi everybody. I am Maura Downey. I am a repository services analyst at Duke University Libraries, and I'm here with my colleague David Chandeck-Stark, who is one of our digital repository software developers. And we're going to talk briefly about the Duke Research Data Repository, give a quick overview and demo. I have a few slides. And then I'm going to go through those pretty quickly, and then we can sort of jump into I can share my screen while I poke around the application. And apologies in advance to folks who've heard me talk about this stuff before. All right, so a little bit of background. In 2016, Duke convened a digital research faculty working group to take under consideration how the university should support research data needs. That group recommended an investment in infrastructure and staffing to support both data management and sharing, which resulted in the hiring of 4 new full-time staff, 2 campus-facing research data management consultants, and 2 sort of more back-end support staff, the repository content analysts. So when we were onboarded, we started with writing our policies and establishing workflows to support data curation. And at the beginning, there was some thought, and I think this has not been unique to Duke, but that we would have one repository for all of our content. And research data would find its home in the Duke Digital Repository, which is our legacy custom Samvera Fedora stack, which has since been Valkyrized. We quickly ran into some issues. The data model with the Duke Digital Repository was somewhat constrained, and we didn't have quite as much flexibility as we would have wanted to accommodate the sort of heterogeneous nature of the data sets we anticipated seeing. There were a couple of other sort of UI issues that we didn't think would be optimal for research data content as well, but that worked well for digital collections. So in early 2018, we were given the green light to work with our software services department to develop a new Hyrex-based research data repository. Duke has been a Samvera partner for a number of years, so we felt that staying in the community was particularly appealing. And then also we had the knowledge that University of Michigan had this Deep Blue data repository that we saw as potentially fertile shoulders, giant shoulders to stand on. So what did we customize? The first thing we started with was we have 4 staff working to review research data submitted. So we knew we wanted to take a really hands-on approach to curating the data before it was made public. So we took away the ability of anyone who is not assigned a curator role to upload their own content to the repository. So we often do some file rearrangement. We can do format migration or normalization, and all of that stuff seemed much easier to do before it made its way into the system. So to deposit data with the RDR, you have to have an active net ID. So we put this homegrown deposit workflow behind shibboleth authentication. The deposit workflow allows researchers to submit metadata about their data set, to choose a license for their data set, to let us know if what size their data set is, or if it's already been assigned a DOI. And then once they complete that workflow, they will be sent an invitation to either Box or Globus, depending on the size of their data, to transfer their data to us so that we can begin our curatorial review. And then finally, Jim Coble, before he left, wrote us a CSV batch uploader tool that we use to ingest files and metadata all at once. So we knew that, so we took away the ability of anyone to edit their own data set. And we're using the proxy deposit process. So we knew that if somebody wanted to make a change to the metadata or something of that along those lines, we needed to have a way to accommodate that. So if the data set, if you're logged in and the data set is a data set that has been deposited on your behalf, you'll see this: you deposited this data set, request modifications. And clicking on that request modifications link just brings up a quick Qualtrics form so they can let us know what changes they need to make. Another thing we did was we tweaked the search results and the data set display page. So we kind of had the sense that if bits of the data set were going to start showing up in search, that might be confusing. If there were any child works associated with the data set, that might be a bit confusing for end users. So we are currently restricting search to only surface top level parent data sets / works. I use these things interchangeably, or a collection. We are using collections. The display page, the work display page, we kind of rearranged a little bit. So we've pushed the data description, the citation, and the total size up to the top. We're using a vertical breadcrumb display, so you can see the data set hierarchy, including its parent collection, if there is one. We took what we lovingly began to refer to as the button farm and collapsed it into a drop-down menu. This is only visible if you are logged in as a curator, and that includes all the actions that you can take about a data set. And then we have this sort of mix of depositor supplied and or curator and system generated metadata, and then the files and folders down at the bottom. Another thing we're doing locally is DOI assignment. So each data set gets a DOI when it's ingested. Curators are the only ones who can assign those. David built us a nice tool, so all we have to do after ingest is click on that assign and register DOI button in the drop-down menu, and it posts the requisite metadata to Crossref's DOI registration queue. So we're using the Crossref API rather than Dataset. Another thing that we took on was dataset versioning. So different from file versioning, we wanted to be able to preserve the intellectual integrity of a data set that has already been made publicly available and signed a DOI. So in the event that we knew people were going to have to make changes occasionally to data sets based on publisher recommendations, or if somebody discovers an error, something along those lines. So each new version of the data set is ingested again. It receives its own DOI, and then we relate those DOIs to one another using Dublin Core replaces and is replaced by. If there's data in the replaces and replaced by field, you get this little versioning widget that pops up at the bottom of the page underneath the file list. And you can see the publication date of each version. The comment is provenance metadata that explains what has changed between the data sets. And then you can also toggle between the versions by clicking on the hyperlinked DOI in the DOI column. We also have restricted search to only surface the most recent version of the data, because we didn't want people who were searching in the application to find old stuff that's been superseded. But if you resolve a DOI for an earlier version of the data from, say, a related article publication, you will find yourself on a page with a big red banner across the top that says these data have been superseded. Here's a link to the new version, and we can take a look at that in the application in just a second. So Globus, we are using Globus for both submission and data dissemination. So depositors with less than 10 gigs during their submission workflow are going to be prompted after they're finished to use Box for data transfer to us. Anything larger than 10 gigs is going to go through Globus, and basically we'll get a notification when they've completed the submission form, and then curation staff go into Globus and set up a share and send the depositor a link to that specific share, and they can start uploading their content. We're also using it for download, as mentioned. Any data sets that are larger than, so all data are available for transfer via Globus, because we figured, if you're already in there and you have an endpoint set up, some people may just find it easier to transfer via in that fashion. But anything that is larger than 3 gigabytes is only going to be available via Globus. We do have this bulk downloading of smaller data. So anything smaller than 3 gigs, you'll see both of these buttons. You can choose your export format and click on that link, click on the export files button, and it'll either prompt you to authenticate via shibboleth or complete a really quick CAPTCHA and then directly download. So when we talked to Michigan about how they had implemented Globus for data dissemination, we sort of realized that the RDR had a sufficiently small enough storage footprint that we could probably take a more simplified approach. So rather than build export packages for each data set on the fly that are then staged on a Globus volume for a period of time, we just decided to keep a snapshot of the whole repository staged for transfer. So every time we add a new data set, as part of the ingest process, curation staff are going to then push a copy of the data to the Globus staging volume. And I will let David correct correct anything erroneous that I have said there. So let me go ahead and stop my share. Oh, nope. Let me share this screen. Okay, so y'all are seeing the repository homepage here. So let's kind of poke around a little bit. This is not going to be a super directed thing, but we've done a little bit on expanding the available documentation help pages. So we have this nice little accordion FAQ here, in addition to some more information about using.
Laura, I don't think anybody's seeing a shared screen.
Sorry.
It just says that you started screen sharing.
Sure.
Zoom does that sometimes. I don't know why.
Okay. So are you seeing
like just stop and restart it and see if that's okay. The good old restart.
I knew this was going to happen to me eventually at some point. Okay. Do y'all see metadata?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So, so this is our sort of expanded documentation. We have this nice little accordion FAQ, this further information. To walk through our deposit workflow very briefly. So let me log in. So we're screening out anyone who has PII, PHI, or restricted or sensitive data because we can't accept that data, that kind of data at this time, unless it's been reviewed by an honest broker with another organization on campus. So we are triaging again based on size of the data. We are asking depositors to agree to this deposit agreement, and then they can enter the metadata for their data set. This looks sort of like a long form, but I think it's only 5 fields that are required. We are taking secondary copies of data, so we don't want to assign a DOI for something that has already received a DOI via another repository. So we want to know about that. And then we ask the depositor to assign a license to their data. If they don't want to use CC0, we've kind of set this up to default to try to persuade people to use CC0. If they don't want to use CC0, they can select another Creative Commons license, but most of our depositors just use CC0. And then when they submit, they'll get next steps. They receive an email notification with a review of everything that they've just answered on through the submission form, and then they'll get, if it's via Box, which this one is, they'll get a link to the Box folder to share their data. Looking at data, so I'm logged in right now and I have a curator role, so I see this more options button, which lets me take actions on the data set. This one in particular has the version widgets. So if someone had resolved to this old version of the data, they would see this big banner at the top. Some other things that we are doing, we're currently using collections, but these are also only something that curation staff can create. We have been in touch with our depositors who are depositing multiple data sets, repeat depositors, and we sort of ask them if they would like to group their data sets together under a collection page, and we sort of solicit some minimal level metadata about the collection to include. We can do some branding for them if they have it available. And so I guess now I can sort of throw it open to anybody who has questions, or David, if you would like to hit anything that I missed.
No, actually, this was very informative for me. I think you should give this presentation to our IT department.
Hi, this is Esme from Princeton. I wanted to ask about keeping everything staged for Globus. How much data are you managing, and does that mean that you have multiple copies of the data?
Did you want
David,
me
I'm going to let you. Yeah, I'm going to let you handle that one.
I haven't checked how much it is lately. I think at the time it was like, what?
I think it
3
was about a
terabytes?
terabyte. Yeah,
Or
that sounds about right.
okay. Yeah, it was like the low single digit terabytes. And we kind of justified it in part. I think that the second copy could serve as, a backup in effect as well. Second copy that way. And I think my thought too was possibly in the long term, assuming that the RDR would be on a trajectory. Sorry, I call it RDR for short, Research Data Repository, would be on a trajectory to move from Fedora to Valkyrie in the back end. That might facilitate not necessarily needing a second copy. I haven't really thought that through all the way, but I think that's obviously, since we're on Fedora now, that's a reason why we need to export stuff so that it's in sort of the human manageable, human readable layout. I don't know if that answers what you're asking, but
Yeah, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we also sort of recognize that it would be likely that we would have to revisit that approach as soon based on our, depending on how how things scaled. But given the rate of growth that we were experiencing, it seemed like a reasonable thing for now that we would be able to sort of punt that down the road for a while. I will say also, given we didn't really have a great way to take larger data sets, now that we do, we may find that our rate of growth accelerates. So yeah, Nabila has a question about the box link. So it is not through Browse Everything. It is using, David, correct me if I'm wrong here, it's using the Box API to automatically create a folder in Box. I should say the other things that get created when someone fills out the data submission form is a CSV metadata manifest with all of their responses that we then use to do the import into the system. It generates a copy of the deposit agreement and some a text file with deposit instructions, just so that we make sure that depositors have all of the information that they will need to complete the deposit process. Yeah, using the Box API.
Okay, yeah.
I was gonna
Yeah.
I was going to show what happens when you click on this Get Data from Globus button, which I forgot to do when I was walking through here. So you will see that this takes you directly to the file, to the data set where it's staged on the Globus volume, you'll get all of the files that are associated with the data set, and then these two system generated files, one of which is a little bit confusing. So we'll have the README that is depositor supplied that's about the data, and then we have a system generated README that is about the data set that includes an export of all of the data set metadata and the license and some other information. And then we get a SHA-1 checksum manifest as well. And you can just transfer it to, if I had my endpoint running, which I don't, but I could transfer it to my local machine.
Are there any other questions for Moira and David? Thank you both. This was great.
I have one quick question, Stan from Penn State. We kind of struggled with the decision for a while on the DOIs and should each version have its own DOI. And ultimately, I'm pretty sure we decided that the versions would not have a separate DOI, but we would kind of expose in the UI, that there is a separate version to see. And I'm just kind of curious if you're like, yes, we definitely made the right decision, or if you struggled with that decision, it was easy for you to say each version should have a DOI. Like, just kind of curious what your thoughts are on that implementation.
Yeah, it's a good question. I know there's not really settled practice around that. I don't think we've had any issues with the decision that we made. I think we've been pretty pleased with it. We've had pushback from at least one depositor who wasn't excited about the idea of the new DOI because they'd already submitted a DOI to the publisher. But we kind of just convinced them that it was okay. And things sort of went normally from there. But yeah, no, I think we've been pleased with the way that this has worked.
Yeah, thanks. My sense is, like, in many ways, it's just about kind of making the decision and being consistent with it, and more so than the trade-offs. But I don't know. Thank you.
Yeah, and there may be particular communities who would have stronger objections about issuing new DOIs. We take data from across disciplines, so we've only had the one objection. So
related to the versioning question, how do you feel about your decision to create a brand new object every single time? Is there situations where, like, being versed in versioning, is there a point where you have concerns? Like, do you have large data sets where those are being versioned, and is that creating, or do you have concerns about that creating storage issues? Have you looked into other ways of doing versioning rather than creating a new object?
Yeah, that's also a really good question. We've kind of treated that as a bridge to cross when we get to it. All of our data to now, I think the largest data set we've accommodated is like 120 gigs. So we're dealing with pretty small stuff on average. David, I'm not sure. So it is we are creating a new copy every time we re-ingest. I mean, there are going to be things sometimes also that change. So it's not, the problem is that it's not an exact copy with a version, right? So it may include new files, or it may include changed files. I think ideally what we'd be,
but it doesn't include like old files. So you can't, like, if you were to lose the metadata or lose the repository, it's not evident that this object over here is related to this object over here without going into the objects themselves.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
So Yeah. I'm just curious about that decision to like store multiple copies essentially of the same file, because that could get unwieldy over time.
Yeah. I don't know, David, do you have any thoughts about that on the back end? We kind of have sort of nibbled around the edge of that as an issue, but haven't really gotten into it. And it again feels like a thing that would become more pressing to address as we scale and grow. But
I mean, I guess there's some different ways to think about it. You know, some storage backends basically handle that. So there isn't really, if you have an exact, you know, if it's exactly the same bit for bit file, it doesn't really store it twice. So it may not, you know, it's sort of an implementation question, I guess, then in that sense. But like Maura said, I think since so far we've largely been dealing with smallish stuff. I think we just sort of didn't really go there. I mean, I think we could talk about that at some point, but I mean, I think even Fedora, such as it is, takes care of that. Maybe somebody could correct me who knows Fedora
Yeah,
much better
it
than I,
doesn't.
sure.
It doesn't right now, but the new Fedora 6, which was just released using OCFL, it doesn't store the same copy, like the same file twice.
I see. Right. So yeah, I mean, your mileage may vary. So, you know, it's definitely an important consideration, I think. If you have, I don't know how much versioning we've done so far either. I mean, I guess that's another question.
yeah, it hasn't been a lot. It's been pretty rare. I want to say out of the 140 data sets we have, I think something like 10 maybe have been versioned. So, and again, that may change as data publishing becomes more common and publishers have become more opinionated about what they'd like to see in data sets.
Hi, this is Sherry Lake from the University of Virginia. I've got a question. You mentioned, of course, that you use, I guess, maybe deep blue data. My question is actually how easy would it be for someone to take your instance or Deep Blue Data's instance and just pick it up and use it? I mean, how much customization would a local site need to do with what you've done?
I'm going to let David speak to that. Thanks, David. Yeah.
Well, gee, that's kind of hard to give a simple answer to, probably. I hadn't really thought about it. I mean,
well, you're showing off this cool tool that all of us want now, and thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I you know, I think probably the main issue is that, you know, really what you want. Typically, you know, people want like mostly what somebody has, but then they want to change some stuff. So, you know, maybe that's where it gets potentially complicated. I mean, I pasted the link to the repository in there for folks to browse. It should be publicly accessible. You know, we have, so we're using Box and Box APIs. I assume those would not be any different for other folks if they wanted to use that stuff. But yeah, I mean, I think part of the issue was, at least when we were working on this, is that in a way, it sort of felt like we customized Hyrax a fair amount, in a sense. I mean, maybe in the sense of kind of departing a bit from where its sweet spot is. Maybe, I mean, it's originally sort of designed as a self-deposit system. So that was sort of the first thing that we kind of, and you know, there were some complications around that. It was a lot of removing stuff, I think, like taking capabilities away from Hyrax essentially, so that people weren't able to do things on their own and had to be mediated. I know right now, somebody asked what version of Hyrax. I know right now we're on basically
2.9.
the latest 2.9.
Yeah.
I think we started somewhere 2.56, maybe somewhere in there. So, you know, I don't know how much it's really changed within the 2x thing. So we're just on the cusp of kind of starting to look at 3 and evaluate that.
That
I
brings
should
up
say
a,
too.
no, I
Oh,
was just
sorry.
saying-
Go ahead, Sherry.
No, that brings up a good question because, you know, I mean, the more, of course, customizations you do, whenever you go to a new version, all those things now have to fit in the way if something's changed, the new version works and things like that. So it's so upgrading to Hyrax, the newer versions is always going to need developer time or whatever to do tweaks and stuff. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, unfortunately, I was not deeply involved in that work at the time because I was in a different role. But my sense was sort of that a lot of the work was kind of at the UI level, which kind of cuts both ways. I mean, sometimes the UI stuff, you know, then you got to go back and like look at the new templates or, you know, think about how did we change it. On the other hand, I think we didn't necessarily kind of get into the inner machinery that much and sort of change that stuff. It was more just a matter of kind of managing the interface. And I think that's largely true, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, we haven't, you know, created new workflows or work types or data models. It's all been pretty standard out of the box stuff for that.
Right.
The one thing I think that also Jim spent much of his time on was the batch ingest part. So
Mhm.